Hey everybody, CyberTao back with you. We're finishing up our coverage of how to handle hanging pawns. We're going to look at one example, which is a bit more nuanced about the d-pawn break. I still think the d-pawn break is the most important tool in the hanging pawn structure's arsenal when you're playing with the hanging pawns. This example is a bit more nuanced in terms of looking at the pawn as a strength in itself, rather than the d-pawn being associated with a direct kingside attack. A lot of times that d-pawn break will be predicated on just a pure sacrificial onslaught against the king side, and the d-pawn is what jailbreaks the activity for all the pieces. Here it's not even a hanging pawn structure, but it transposes to the exact sort of position you would get from hanging pawns, and I still think it's very instructive to look at. This game between Mamedyarov against Mamedyarov-Adams, 2018 Olympiad. Mamedyarov is white, d4. Knight f3, d5. So black chooses to transpose to a queen's gambit declined here. Basically, he's saying that white committing to knight f3 is a concession of some sorts. There are some lines of the queen's gambit declined exchange where white develops his knight to e2 instead, and those tend to be a little bit more dangerous for black. So knight f3 is a little bit of a concession in terms of queen's gambit declined structures. Of course, d5 is not the only move here. There's the Queen's Indian with b6, perfectly solid. There's the Bogo Indian with bishop b4. This is part of my repertoire. Also quite solid, very similar to the Nimzo Indian in flavor, of course. c5 would be an attempt to get into a Benoni, which would be the structure here. This was very popular in the 90s, this move order for black, because a lot of the Benoni positions where white hasn't played knight f3 are very dangerous for black. Those are lines where white plays a very fast e4, f4, and plays for e5 immediately. So black is saying that he's happy to play Benoni as long as white is committed to knight f3. Now this is less important because we know that some lines for white with bishop d3 and h3 are just as dangerous. So that move order nicely has sort of gone away, and if someone's willing to play the Benoni, they'll play it in any move order. So, just a quick opening review there. But d5 was played. It's quite solid, of course. Knight c3, c5. So this is either the Tarrasch or the semi-Tarrasch. White takes on d5, which is really the only good move. Knight x d5. So this is the semi-Tarrasch. This is black's way of avoiding playing with an isolated pawn. Ex d5 would be the full Tarrasch. And black basically commits to playing with an isolated pawn. In return, he'll get the usual boons that you receive when you play with an isolated pawn. You get a lot of activity, open scope for your pieces. Modern theory thinks that black is fine. Maybe white's a little bit better. Some of the theory is getting very complex on that matter. But it's a position full of life. If you like playing with an isolated pawn and you're looking for something a little bit more aggressive, I would definitely recommend the Tarrasch. But semi-Tarrasch is quite solid. e4 is played in the game. Honestly, I think we're going to see more and more people moving away from e4. e3 keeps a lot more tension in the position, and in my opinion, it tends to lead to a bit more aggression on white's part. There's less minor pieces coming off the board in this line, which allows white to create more complexity and maybe challenge black a little bit more. e4, it looks ideal because you're getting this broad pawn center. But bishop b4 check was played. This is right. Black wants to trade off some more minor pieces to make his lack of space a bit more amenable. So the pawns in e4 and d4 look quite nice, but we've already got two sets of minor pieces off the board, so it's harder for white to generate some sort of kingside attack because of that central space. Really, white's main idea in this position is the d-pawn break, and this is why we're looking at this game, because it'll transpose exactly to sort of hanging pawn position where white achieves that d-pawn break. This is really his only idea in this position. It's hard to make hay in a position where you only have one idea. It's sort of similar to the principle of two weaknesses, that you tend to want to have different ideas to stretch your opponent over different parts of the board. Here, everything's associated with this d-pawn. So as long as black retains control of the d-pawn, he's going to be okay. And modern theory shows that black is doing just fine here. It's at the top level, it's hard to make anything in this position. At a lower level, of course, you can play opening 3 matters much less at a lower level. You can just play whatever you're most comfortable with. But here, White's only real idea is the d4, d5 pawn break. So bishop c4, it's the most logical, it supports that break. Knight d7, b6, another move order. It might be what I prefer because it keeps the idea of bishop a6, perhaps. Carlsen played that, I believe. Knight d7 is fine as well. It just transposes in this game. So this is as ideal as a position as you could imagine for White coming out of here. Now, the rooks are perfectly placed to support the d-pawn break. The bishop's on its natural diagonal to support this d-pawn break. And I still think Black is doing just fine. Central space matters when it's taking important squares away from your opponent. And here, Black has been able to develop quite flexibly and naturally without really any bother whatsoever. White's central space hasn't yet generated any benefits for White. Again, everything's associated with this d-pawn break. h6, rook e8's probably a little bit better. Just, we know d4, d5's coming, so why not fight for the e file before it happens? But h6 isn't bad. h3, just a small little improving move in the same vein, making Luft at some points, so he doesn't have to worry about tactical variations where he's getting bitten in the back rank. Rook e3, so this is a nice little improving move. White's basically improving all the position that he can before playing that d4, d5 pawn break. This rook is very flexible on e3. It can hop to d3, where it can White's triple on the d file in preparation for that break. This other rook on d1 can come to e1, and that helps support the d-pawn break as well. Or, this knight can move away and we could lift to the king side. Very flexible rook move. I like this quite a bit. 6. Queen f4. This is a little bit dangerous from Black. In fact, I'm not sure about the value of Queen f6. Yeah, I'm not sure about... Queen f4 is very dangerous. I might just play something like Queen e7, just basically marking time. Basically, Black's just holding in place while waiting for White to finally commit to d4, d5. Queen f4 is very dangerous here. g3, this unnecessarily weakens the White king side. Of course, this is unrelated to the position we're going to be looking at, but e5, just an aside, completely correct. Cutting off the retreat lane for the black queen, so suddenly this queen's a little bit annoyed. Plus, notice how that these pawns actually restrain Black's position finally. It stops the knight from hopping to f6. This pawn's still stopping the knight from hopping to c5. The pawns are on the opposite color of the bishop on b3, so they're not blocking the bishop's scope. One possible line. Bishop c2, so now g3 really is threatened. g3, tick, bishop b3. And White has a real advantage here. White has bishop versus knight, which is almost always an advantage. This pawn on e5 genuinely restrains Black's position. Plus, it's hard for Black to stop d5 in a position like this, just because White has so much influence over the square, and there's no good route for the knight on f8 to hop into d5. Eventually, it can hop from g6 to e7 to d5, but that's a time investment. And White should be able to achieve d5 before then. But g3, inaccurate. The Black queen just retreats to c7. And now d5. So this is where we get into the hanging pawn structure that I was wanting to look at. So, yeah, let's talk about this position a little bit. So, this is the sort of pawn break where White hasn't played this for the sake of a sacrificial onslaught against the Black king side. It's more this pawn on d5 being a strength in itself. Now, is it a strength in itself? It is. It's a passed pawn, and it's already on the 5th rank, and there's really no good way for Black to stop it from going to d6, other than physically blockading it. But it's also an isolated pawn. And advancing this pawn to d6 would weaken the long diagonal in its wake. That would, basically, as a pawn advances, it controls less and less squares behind it, and creates weaknesses in its wake. This position is still finely balanced, in my opinion. This is a good example of a position where the strengths and the weaknesses of the pawn are sort of finely balanced. But I will say, practically, it's harder for the defending side. And that's almost always the case. It's harder to defend than it is an attack. So when you get a strong passed pawn like this, practically you're going to have excellent results, because it's hard to put your defensive hat on and just play a purely passive game. You know, there's some people that get a thrill and a pleasure out of playing that sort of chess, but most people, it's hard to retain that sort of defensive presence all game. So this is still finely balanced, but it's hard to keep up the defensive bastions long term. Queen c5. Black goes wrong immediately, so queen d6 just has to be played. Typically, you don't want to blockade a pawn with the queen. If black had a chance to just magically teleport a piece, he would like to teleport this knight from d7 to d6, because knights are the best blockaders of pawns. But in this case, black just has to work with whatever he has. Queen d6 has to be played. One potential line at d4. Queen c5 is fine now that the d file is blocked, so d6 is impossible here. Queen f3. I give another line in the notes that you can look at. Or a5. So this is a finely balanced standoff. Notice that d6 isn't possible because of the weaknesses on the long diagonal. This is a direct consequence of white's earlier mistake with g3. If g3 weren't on the board, black would feel more urgency in terms of blockading this pawn, because then d6 would just be possible and strong. But basically the essence of this, when you're playing against the hanging pawns and the d-pawn is just being used as a strength in itself, you need to make sure that pawn is either blockaded or it's impossible to feasibly advance that pawn without losing it. Here, queen c5 accomplishes neither. It's just sort of it actually forces the queen to improve itself. So white plays queen f4. That aims at the f7 pawn, which the bishop on b3 aims at, but it also controls the square in front of the pawn. It controls the next square forward for the strong pass pawn. That's exactly the sort of methodology you want to use when you're playing with a strong pass pawn like this. You want to control the squares in front of the pawn and securely advance it. So queen c3, that's also a mistake. Just flat out misplacing the queen. Knight f6 is better, blocking the influence on the f-pawn and putting some pressure on the d-pawn. One potential line. This is better for white. So we've got bishop versus knight, which is a huge edge. The pawn is on d6, which is a genuine strength. The knight on f6 is paralyzed, blocking off the pressure on f7. But black is holding for now, and it's hard. It'll be a little bit hard for white to make progress because we have no pieces that can attack d8. If white still had a dark square bishop, you can imagine a scenario where we play d7 and then bishop comes to e7 quickly to break the blockade. Or if we had a knight, could eventually hop to c6 and break the blockade on d8. Ideally, black can trade queens off somehow and then just try to set up some desperate last stand blockade on the dark squares, because white's bishop is on light squares, so there's no way for white to make progress in dark squares. So this would still be better for white. White's calling the shots here, but black still has defensive chances. Queen c3 completely misplaces the black queen. And this is where we see this d-pawn and a strength in itself also transition to being a part of an aggressive attack, which is always a possibility, because as that pawn strength grows, its ability to tie down the enemy's pieces also grows. So knight d4. Heading for f5, that's almost always a strong square when you're attacking a kingside for a knight. Kasparov made his living off playing knight f5 against the castle black king. And also blocking the black queen's influence on the kingside. That diagonal is completely blocked off now. Rook e8. d6. So the white pawn advances yet again. So now it's on the 6th rank, which is even stronger. The path to f7 is opened up, which specifically benefits the bishop on b3. But really, even if we didn't have this bishop on b3, the fact that we've gotten our pawn to d6 is the next strong step. Now that pawn is just radiating pure terror across the board. Knight f6. King h2. This is a nice little timeout move that you see in games of very strong players. They just sort of tidy up the variations, so they don't have to worry about playing a defensive move in the middle of tactical complications, because they've already played that nice little defensive move. It just clears out the back rank, so white doesn't have to worry about weird mating combinations occurring. One potential for a mistake, d7 would be a genuine error here. Of course, the knight can't take because white would take an f7, but suddenly, this pawn in d7 is a weakness. It's when you're handling a pawn like this, you don't want to push too quickly, because it's entirely possible for that pawn to outkick its coverage and end up being a weakness that needs to be babysat. So here, queen c4 hits the bishop on a4, bishop has to drop back, and there's just no way for white to make progress here, because this pawn on d7 is going to hang. So bishop a4 is forced, then black just kicks it right back. So king h2 just sort of cleans up the tactical variations in S. Black to find a move first before we make progress. Queen b2, this is pretty much a decisive error. Bishop e4 is the best move. One potential line. This is still much, much better for white. But at least black is going to make white work for it. You know, white's going to have to play a messy move like g5 to chase that knight away. And then black can hope for something to happen in the tactical complications. Queen b2 just sort of shuffles. It's allowing white to play for free. Knight c2, this is an error. d7 is completely correct. Now all these variations work. So rook d8, of course the knight can't take. And then bishop c2 check blocks off the pawn on f2, and then this rook on e8's hanging. So rook d8's forced. Knight f5. So again, a knight coming to f5 is almost always incredibly strong against the castle black king side. Rook d7. King h7's forced. If black takes, that's checkmate. Rook takes, and then just knight takes to f7. This is carnage. You know, white's up a pawn. He has a continuing maiden attack. This game is completely over. I give a couple other variations in there, but really what it boils down to is it's hard to look at the passed d-pawn as just a strength in itself, because it always has this incredibly dangerous potential to completely disrupt the opponent's position. Where, if not for this passed d-pawn, black might be able to set up some sort of defensive barricades, but because of the strength of this passed d-pawn, that completely disrupts black's ability to do so. Now, black can't effectively defend, because he's trying to defend against this passed d-pawn, plus defend against his weakened king side. So, knight c2 is incorrect, d7 would just flat out win. Repeating moves, and then white finally finds it. Yeah, queen b2, again, a mistake. You know, this gives black another chance to go back to bishop e4, which is more tenacious. But Mamedyarov, when given a second chance, you know, he's one of the best players in the world, so he finally plays it. And goes right into the variation we just looked at. Adams goes for another line, bishop e4. Knight d6, of course just attacking the bishop on e4. Knight c4, so I really love the path this knight took. It's like a fancy billiard shot. It goes knight d4, f5, d6, c4, hitting the queen on b2, and then it's going to hop to e5, which supports the pawn on d7, hits the bishop on g6, attacks f7. I just love the aesthetics of the path this knight took and what it's hitting on its way. But this is completely decisive for white. Queen e2, knight e5. So the knight's threatening to take on g6. It can come to c6 at some point. This is completely devastating. King h7. g4 was played. Rook d6 is also crushing. Just the threat of rook takes f6. That's a devastating exchange sacrifice. One potential line. This is absolutely crushing for white as well. And then the strength of this passed d-pawn, it's always going to be a resource, an attacking resource. It's hard to just look at it as a pure endgame issue, because that passed d-pawn is always going to be a threat to overstrain a defender's resources. And here, of course, white's just completely winning. Knight f6 check is coming in, either capturing d7. But g4 was played. This is also winning. Queen e3, this is sort of playing with the food. Rook d6 is just more effective. And this is a cute tactical variation. Yeah, and this is completely over as well. Queen e3, it's still winning. It's just taking the slow way around. Queen b2, you know, black could stretch this out with queen x e3. But white has a completely paralytic grip on the position. You know, next moves are going to be something like h4, g5, and then just knight c6. This is over as well, but queen b2 immediately collapses. King g1, knight takes g6, and black finally resigned here. Queen e7, this has no adequate response. Again, the passed d-pawn ends up being what finishes black off in this position. Once that pawn gets to the 7th rank, it's impossible to put up nearly impossible to put up an effective barricade if there's other weaknesses to take care of. If black's kingside were completely secure, maybe black can organize some sort of lasting blockade on d8, but that's incredibly difficult. It's also incredibly passive. So beautiful game from Mamedyarov. Again, the relation that it has to hanging pawns starts on this d5 push. And what the hanging pawns in this position have in common is that d-pawn break is the heart of the position. And really, the key to this position is figuring out whether it's a strength or a weakness. And here, it's completely balanced, theoretically, but practically, it's always harder to be on the defending side. Now, black needs to be incredibly careful in keeping these squares under control. Whenever black sort of has a lapse and allows those squares to go under enemy control, that's when the enemy pawn starts pushing. That's when that d-pawn starts jetting up the board. It's possible for the pawn to go too far too quickly, as we saw in a couple of lines. Like in this position, d7 would be a chance for the pawn to go too far, too fast. Where suddenly it's outstripped its support. This is just a dead draw. But as long as a white's playing carefully, the more this pawn advances, the stronger it becomes. And when you're able to control the squares in front of the pawn and methodically advance that pawn up the board, that's when that strength becomes nearly overwhelming, and that passed pawn is just completely killing. So excellent game from Mamedyarov. We're going to look at one more example of how to attack with hanging pawns. This won't involve any d-pawn break. This would just be sort of a pure example of how to attack the king side without the hanging pawns becoming a factor at all. So we'll look at some piece patterns involved in that. My name is John. I'll see you then.